Welcome to the Dual Enrollment Funding Models, Where Does Your State Stand? Webinar through MEC. I'm Carrie Wandler. I'm the Director of Policy Initiatives at MEC, and I want to thank everyone for joining. There's a few housekeeping things that we'd like to cover before we move on to the presentation. We're recording the conversation and post the recording to our website after the presentation. We welcome questions, so please use the Q&A box and we will do our best to address all questions. Mary will post a link to the presentation in the chat, and upon closing out today's meeting, you'll have an opportunity to take a brief survey, so please complete it to help us improve our future convenings. So we're thrilled to welcome Jennifer Zinth, founder and principal of Zinth Consulting. Jennifer is a nationally recognized expert on dual enrollment and post-secondary transition policy. With over 20 years of experience, including 2 decades at the Education Commission of the States, she's advised numerous states and national organizations and authored influential research shaping education policy across the country. We're excited to be working with her along with Complete College America for our Midwest Dual Enrollment State Policy Workshop this summer, and we're most pleased to have her join us here today. So please, Jennifer.
All right, thank you, Carrie, and thank you so much for that introduction. Thanks also to MEC for hosting today's webinar talking about recent changes in dual enrollment funding models. And so where we're headed today is I'll be providing an overview of updates to the Funding for Equity report, which was originally released in 2019, and then an update was released in February. So we'll be looking at not just what's the national landscape of state level dual enrollment funding models, but what are some of the considerations for states as they look to update or revise, enhance their funding models in order to serve more students across the state. And this is the report, and I think someone's going to drop a link in the chat. Thank you so much. It was published by College and High School Alliance in partnership with NACEP, and I was the lead author and researcher for this report. It's actually in a sense, it's an update to research that I started back at Education Commission of the States in 2006. In 2008, the very first 50-state analysis of dual enrollment policies was released by ECS, and state funding models was one of the 18 or 19 elements in that 50-state analysis. And so I did the first update. The first update was released in 2008, and then there were several iterations. I was last involved with the 2019 update. And so this report is really intended to answer the question that I would receive all the time at ECS, and that was, what's the one best funding model for dual enrollment for my state? Is there just another state's policies that I can block and copy and use in my state? And I would always try to explain that there's not one best funding model because there's so many considerations that need to be taken into account in terms of the aspirations for the program, the political and financial leanings of the state, sort of philosophy of, what dual enrollment is about and whom it should serve and how. So you'll see if you look at the report, there for each of the various funding models, there are some of those considerations. So we'll be talking a little bit about those today. But I hope this updated report will significantly enhance program progress in the states. And more states will adopt models that can reach more students and offer more courses for more students. And so just as with the 2019 original report, there are 3 different approaches. However, from the 2019 to the 2025 update, we have 1 additional model that is included. And as you can see, there are 3 models under this where student pays no tuition, where either the state pays or the combination of the district and state pay, or the district pays. There's the local decision model, which means that a student might pay anywhere from 0 tuition to full tuition. And then there's the student pays reduced tuition. And here's where there's an additional model added for 2025. Originally in the 2019 report, we had costs split between either the state and the student or the district and the student. And based on the responses to research that I did last year, we found that there was an increasingly common model where it was a state and district and student. Or it could be either the state or district and student, but it was locally determined which would be the state or the district. And so for each of these 7 approaches, the report provides the rationale for this model. Like, what would be the benefit to students if a state were to adopt this? What might be the benefits also to either a school district or post-secondary institution? It also weighs the benefits and challenges for various types of stakeholders. It offers questions that states would need to ask themselves to determine whether a model was an appropriate fit for the leanings of that particular state, as well as examples of best practices and lessons learned from states that have adopted a particular model. And so just a few notes before we dive into the content. The research that you see here reflects funding models that were in place as of last September. And I want to note that policy has already changed in Arkansas with legislation that was passed in March. It was legislation that made sweeping changes to not just concurrent enrollment, not just concurrent enrollment funding, but also advanced placement, IB, other post-secondary or readiness for post-secondary models. In Arkansas's previous funding model, there was a scholarship program that was available to students for a limited number of courses, primarily in grades 11 and 12, possibly in grade 10. And there was a separate model for low-income students to access up to 6 credit hours at no cost to them. Under the new model in Arkansas that was just passed and I believe was going to affect this fall, students and parents cannot be charged at all for tuition or fees or materials for concurrent enrollment courses. And just a word about the methodology for the research that informed this report. I went into 50 state statutes, regulations, higher education governing documents, websites, and then after having analyzed all of those materials, I sent an email to at least one person in each state, and I suspect that a few people on this call today were the recipients of my emails last year, confirming that everything is accurately conveyed in the appendix, especially. And sometimes a little back and forth was involved. And then once we reached a conclusion on that, then that information was included in the report. I should also note that there are a number of states that actually have 2 or more dual enrollment funding models. Perhaps there's a different model for courses that are offered at the high school versus courses offered on the post-secondary campus. And so you'll see in the report that in those states, each funding model is categorized separately. So technically, there are more than 50 models included in this report. I also wanted to point out, and this question came up as I was doing the research with some of the state agency staff, that report only covers which entity is responsible for paying dual enrollment tuition for public school students. So it does not include funding models that some states have for either private or homeschool students. It doesn't indicate whether the school district or the post-secondary institution receives the same amount of state funding for each student as they would receive for a regular high school or post-secondary student. It also doesn't analyze the tuition amount that the institution receives compared to the tuition that the institution would receive for a regularly matriculated student. It doesn't look at textbooks, fees, transportation, etc. And it also looks only at dual enrollment, which for purposes of this report is an umbrella term referring to college courses offered to high school students, regardless of who's teaching, course location, modality. And as such, it does not include early college or middle college high school funding models. I would love someday to do additional research on that topic, but this was not in the scope of this report. And so I have to say that I was doing some research last fall, looking at the 2024 legislative session and even a few sessions back. And I think it's accurate to say that state funding models are quite probably the largest and most impactful area of state policy change over the last 5+ years since the original Funding for Equity was published. And there have been a few common trends that we've seen in state policy changes over the last 5 years, broadening, leveling the playing field for student access and opportunity. So you'll see that there are more states now than there were in 2019 that have the state pays model. There's also some things that may broaden or level the playing field that may not necessarily appear to be offering equal access, but in reality do impact that. So one of them is institutions being reimbursed directly by the state agency rather than going through the school districts. Reducing that paperwork burden makes districts and high schools more interested in participating in the program. And then lastly, states are stepping up their program reporting requirements because as they're making greater investments in these programs, they want to make sure they know what kind of what students are being served, how many courses they're taking, what types of courses, and those are reported to the state. Sometimes they're also publicly reported, but at a minimum, they're reported to state agencies just to keep tabs on who's participating and what might be the outcomes of the course participation. We also saw over the last several years that there are a lot more state appropriations that are supporting dual enrollment funding models. And we also saw that particularly states using their COVID dollars from 2020 and 2021 to subsidize dual enrollment costs, at least over the short term. And so the first model that we'll be looking at today is the state pays model. And obviously, the big benefit of this one is that students and parents are not responsible for tuition regardless of the student's family's income. And so today we have 19 states that have the state pays model. And this is a fairly significant increase since the 2019 report. The new states here are Arkansas, District of Columbia, Hawaii, Montana, Rhode Island, Washington, and West Virginia. And I might note that this is the first slide we're going to see where there are states that have two or more models, and one state is colored in here, and the state is colored in a second time on the excuse me, on the another state's funding model. So for example, you'll see Washington State colored in here. They passed legislation in 2023 that replaced their pre-existing funding model for concurrent enrollment, which is called college in the high school in Washington. And previously it was locally determined. So it could be where the district would cover costs and the student might pick up the rest. It might be in other districts where the student was completely paying their own way. In 2023, they replaced that with a state-funded model. Now there's a separate model for Running Start, which is where students take courses either online or on the post-secondary campus, and we'll talk about that later, but I just wanted to point that out. Another example here is Minnesota, where they have three different models, and Minnesota is colored in here for the post-secondary enrollment options model, which is where courses are taken on the college campus. There are different models for courses that are offered at the high school or for a local PSDO by contract, it's called, where it's locally determined between the school district and the post-secondary partner how much the district will pay. And so, but once you look across these states and you lift the hood a little bit across these 19 states, there's a different state funding approach in each of these colored in states. And you also see there are several states, Alabama, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, where they subsidize tuition for some, but not all high school students. And it's not related to family income. It's locally determined by grant funds, how many students in which districts have their tuition covered. Another thing to point out here is that it's not a free-for-all in these states in terms of number of courses or the students who may enroll in these state-covered courses. In some instances, states may only cover a limited number of courses or credit hours, or they may limit participation to 12th graders or 11th and 12th graders. In Kansas, for example, you'll see colored in. It's only specific types of CTE courses that are covered by state funds. And in some instances, it's a limited delivery model, such as concurrent enrollment, or an institution type, such as community colleges, where state funds are used to cover tuition. And so in some states, once those students have completed these state-funded credit hours, or if students take courses that are outside these parameters, such as they want to exceed the number of credit hours covered by the state, or they're a 10th grader, but only 11th and 12th graders get state subsidized dual enrollment tuition, et cetera, then it's going to be the student or the school district that might be responsible for covering those the tuition for those additional courses. So one model of all of these models to consider, if you're looking to shift over to a state pays model, Idaho might be a state worth looking at. They'd gone through a series of changes over probably a better part of a decade in terms of how they were not fully covering, but largely covering students' dual enrollment tuition. And they finally, in I think 2016 or so, 2017, landed on a model that's unique. There's no other state like it in the country, no other state funding model like it in the country. And so each student in a public school from grades 7 through 12 has an account established for them that's $4,625. And those funds can be drawn down by the student either for dual credit tuition, which is at a standard rate of $75 per credit hour statewide, or they can use those funds for AP or IB exam fees, for CTE certification or licensure exam fees, etc. But I am told that the vast majority of these funds are used for dual credit tuition. And so rather than the state having to, the legislature having to keep pace with enrollments and approve ever increasing appropriations as more students participate and take more courses, the program is funded through a reoccurring appropriation. So it's not which way the weather is blowing in the legislative session this year, if the payment amount is going to keep pace with the number of students and credit hours completed. It also is beneficial that it removes the accountability and responsibility from school district and post-secondary partners. So when a student decides to enroll in a course, they enter a state portal, sign into their account, and then once they've enrolled in that course, when they've completed that course, the state disperses those account funds from that fund to the post-secondary institution. So it really simplifies processes for the student, the school district partner, and for the post-secondary partner. And so moving on now to a model where, again, students don't pay. It's a combination of the state and the school district pay. And we actually saw a reduction in the number of states from 2019, where there were 5 states, to 2024, where there were just 3 states using this model. And so Rhode Island was reclassified. Previously, they had excuse me, 2 models. One was, nowadays, it's the state pays for concurrent enrollment and part-time dual enrollment on the college campus. And then the district pays for full-time dual enrollment on the college campus. But so they are no longer a combination of state and district pay. And then Washington, a Running Start, was reclassified this year as a combination of state, district, and student pay rather than state and district pay, since in some instances costs are passed along to students. And so one model to consider out of these 3 states that do have this model is Iowa. And so it's local control. And again, I should add that Iowa is the only state of this is the only funding model of its type in the country for dual enrollment tuition. In Iowa, districts and post-secondary institutions establish local agreements that include the tuition amount that the school district will pay the post-secondary institution. And the following fiscal year, the school district receives an additional weight in the state funding formula based on the portion of the school day that a student was enrolled in a post-secondary course. And so the funding is, again, tied to participation rates, not to an appropriation. So it keeps pace with the number of students participating and the number of courses enrolled. And it also is unique in that it provides a higher cost payment to the school district for CTE course enrollments. And so districts receive an additional weight of 0.5 for each student in a liberal arts course for the portion of the school day that they're in that course, but a weight of 0.7 for CTE courses, so acknowledging the fact that facilities, materials, equipment, sometimes also instructor costs can be higher for CTE courses than for liberal arts courses. And then our third model, where students do not pay, is where the district pays. And in 2024, we saw 11 states with this model. And I should note that Indiana is colored in here, but this model, district pays, applies only for courses that are offered by institutions that belong to the statewide community college system, the IB Tech system, on the college campus. And these courses represent only a tiny fraction of all of the college courses completed by Indiana high school students. The vast majority of courses are offered at the high school by an approved high school instructor through what's called the dual credit model. So this is a change from 8 states in 2019, and we saw 2 states that no longer have this model. One was Iowa post-secondary enrollment options, which is no longer active, and then the other one was an Illinois vocational education CTE type of program. And then there were 5 state models that were added in this most recent iteration. These include Indiana for the courses offered by Ivy Tech campuses on the college campus, Maryland, Minnesota PSEO by contract, which we did not include in the 2019 report, for also Rhode Island for full-time enrollment at a community college, and also South Dakota when the faculty member travels to teach the course at the school district. And so we see here, there's just a few states where the cost, and this is the first example where students do contribute to tuition payments. And so just a few examples here where the state and the student share payments, Indiana and Utah. And I should add that this applies only for students who aren't eligible for free and reduced price lunch. By state law, Indiana institutions cannot charge students who are free reduced lunch eligible for dual credit coursework. And then we have Michigan, which is one state where the district and the student share payments. And so the district pays most of the tuition costs, but they're authorized to pass on to the student any costs that the school district is not required to cover. Excuse me. And then we have a growing number of states where it's locally determined in a sense, where the costs are split either between the state and the student, or the district and the student, or 3 ways across the state, district, and the student, although it may not be equally parsed among those 2 or 3 parties. And you can see these states listed here. So one model to consider if you're looking at having students cover some portion of their tuition, but not foot the whole bill, is Indiana. And so the model here is where students receive an incentive to enroll in broadly transferable and applicable courses. And so priority courses are generally gen ed courses, liberal arts courses that transfer across to public 2- and 4-year institutions across the state, as well as a small number of independent institutions that choose to participate, as well as for CTE dual credit courses, the next level program of study courses. And so welcome students, as I mentioned earlier, don't pay. And even though in policy, institutions are authorized to charge non-low-income students $25 per credit hour, in practice, a number of institutions waive dual credit tuition for all students, partly because perhaps they see that as part of their mission in serving students, maybe partly because this may be a recruitment or a factor where students begin credits towards a certificate or degree and they can complete them once they matriculate. And so not only are students incentivized into courses that are likely to transfer and apply to degrees or certificate programs, there's also an incentive for institutions to offer these courses in that every biennium, institutions receive a partial reimbursement for offering these courses based on reported credit hours earned in these courses. And last I heard, it was roughly $50 per credit hour, which doesn't fully cover the institution's costs in offering the courses, but it does somewhat defray the cost. And those funds are intended to be used for supporting the dual credit model, which in Indiana is supposed to be NACEP accredited. So there are some costs associated with annual professional development and training, onboarding, with program oversight and site visits, that sort of thing. And then the final model we'll talk about today is either local decision or policy silence. And as you can see, there are 24 states today that have this funding model. And this would include states where it's locally determined who covers a student's tuition after a student completes state-paid courses. And I just wanted to call out a couple of things. One, in 2019, we didn't include this category in the report because we were concerned that including in the report might somehow validate this model when in fact, of all of the funding models, it poses the greatest potential to have disparities from one school district to the next. So you might have one school district that through whatever source, maybe it's private funding, maybe the institution is waiving tuition, maybe the district and the institution are helping cover student tuition costs. Students pay nothing, and then you go to the next district over, and students are paying the same rate that an adult student would pay. So it is a little concerning that this model is so prevalent across the states. Excuse me. I wanted to point out that you'll see California colored in here. Per state policy, students may not be charged tuition, but in practice, community colleges waive tuition both for students in what's called the CCAP program, as well as students who are referred to as special part-time or full-time high school students. So two different delivery models for dual enrollment in California, but in practice, students do not pay tuition. You'll also see Texas colored in here. In 2023, legislation was passed that created what's called the FAST program that covers dual credit tuition at participating institutions for students who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch in any of the 4 years prior to enrolling in a dual credit course. However, that's only for low-income students. It's gotten a lot of publicity or attention, but for students who are not FAST eligible, it's locally determined between the school district and the post-secondary partner who will pay those tuition costs. I just wanted to point out a few extra features of the 2025 updates that I'm really excited about. And so this webinar has provided a few examples of state models to consider. We wanted to really focus readers' attention to models. There's more than 50 models out there. If a state is shopping around for an improved model, how do they know where to look? And so the first section of the appendix provides exactly that. And so you'll see a screenshot of the first page of this section of the appendix. And it includes states, a quick summary of the state's funding model, and then some key features like what makes this funding model stand out and makes it worthy of consideration for other states. And so there's 6 or 7 states that are put forward as leading models to consider. Idaho and Indiana just happened to be the first 2 in that section of the webinar or in the report. I'm very excited about this feature. It's an alphabetical listing of states and funding approaches. And so you can look up any state, and if a state has more than one model, you'll see each of those models mentioned independently of one another. For example, Arizona, you can see there's a different model for when courses are offered on the post-secondary campus versus when courses are offered through a community college at the high school. And so I hope this will be a really tremendous resource for states that want to dig a little bit deeper in terms of what other states are doing as they're considering changes to their own state policies. And then last but not least, there's a section that includes information about state models that insist that low-income students are charged either little to no tuition. And as I mentioned at the beginning, Arkansas changed its policy just 2 months ago, and so they would no longer be in this category because all students' tuition is covered, not just low-income students. And so just a few questions for attendees thinking about revising their state funding model. Before you go too deep in the weeds and look at the different states that are out there, some things that state leaders might want to consider. And so first of all, people might want to think about whether their state has identified the intended participants, the student outcomes, the goals of dual enrollment participation, because we don't want it just to be free college credit for all, because as we all know, or when it's framed as such, students tend to accumulate excess credit that ends up transferring when they matriculate as elective credit, or it's not recognized for credit transfer at all. If state has identified the participants of student outcomes goals of dual enrollment participation, they might want to look to see if there are reliable data that bear out that programs are serving the students that the programs are intended to serve and producing the intended outcomes, because that could inform changes to the state policy. If a state hasn't identified participants, student outcomes, goals, et cetera, of dual enrollment participation, they might want as a first step to consider identifying these before looking at revisions to their dual enrollment funding model. State leaders might also think about looking at data for disparities in dual enrollment participation, either by student subgroup, geography, other characteristics, because those could also inform changes to the dual enrollment funding model. And then looking at, just from my own personal experience, if you're looking at to revise your state's or maybe advocate for revisions to your state's dual enrollment funding model, there are a few different ways that states have gone about this. So one is creating a state level dual enrollment task force. So a few examples listed here from the past decade. In Kentucky, it was interesting. When I was at ECS, I released a report in 2014 that was called 13 Model Policy Components. And the State Commissioner of Education in Kentucky went to his Senate and House Ed chairs and said, I want you to make me do what this report tells us to do. And so the Senate and House Ed chairs issued a document directing him to create a task force that met in 2014 and 2015 and resulted in Kentucky's dual credit policy that was adopted and went into effect in 2016. And it's been revised a couple of times, but it's very similar to the original policy that was adopted in 2016. And so these task forces typically are charged with making policy recommendations, not just on dual enrollment finance, but dual enrollment finance as one component of a larger set of policy changes. And the caveat that I would have with having worked with some of these state task forces is that states need to be very careful to make sure that they include the appropriate participants, that there's a clear charge that is doable, and there's reasonable deadlines in order to achieve any actionable recommendations or any recommendations at all, because there have been instances where maybe not the right participants were on board, or the charge wasn't clear, or the timeline wasn't clear, and the task force results were not what everyone had hoped for. Um, Another option is to have a third-party entity create a landscape and recommendations reports. And so this was what was done in Arkansas, where I worked with the Department of Higher Education, the Department of Division of Higher Education, the K-12 division, the CTE division, Complete College America, and some other partners. And the result was a report that was released in January 2024 that informed Division of Higher Education rules last July, and then the legislation that I mentioned that was passed in March. And so it was really effective to have a third-party person come and say, here's the state policy landscape, here are the challenges that state and local stakeholders have identified, and here's what your state could do, or here's what other states are doing to address similar challenges. And then state agency staff are empowered to use these findings to lobby for a state policy change. And then another model that I've seen work in some states is where state staff themselves, aside from a recommendations report necessarily or a task force, they are charged with proposing changes. And in Colorado, in 2008, it was the state P20 Council, and there was a subgroup of the council that was tasked with creating recommendations for a revised policy, because at that time in Colorado, there were several different models, each with their different eligibility requirements, funding approaches, etc. And it was extremely confusing for students, families, and schools. And so there was relatively low participation among most students. And so the governor basically told the P20 Council subgroup, like, if you don't make recommendations, I'll just, make my own recommendations. And so they had a timeline and a charge, and they developed recommendations that found their way into the 2009 legislation that was passed that has more or less been states steady, had been the same since 2009. And it's been very effective in increasing the number of students across geography, across student subgroups across the state, and participating in dual and concurrent enrollment. And then in Rhode Island, in, I want to say 2014, 2015, legislation was passed. And at that time, Rhode Island didn't have state policy for dual enrollment that tasked the Board of Education and the Board of Higher Education to collaborate on developing policy for dual enrollment. And there were very few parameters set around that in legislation. It was basically just saying, you guys, this topic, you take care of it. And that has also been very effective in increasing not just the funding for dual enrollment participation, but increasing the number of students in course sections completed. And so with that, we have about 25 minutes left. I would love to, I know there's been some things dropped in the chat. Open it up for questions, discussion, brainstorming if you like, anything else that might be on your mind on dual enrollment funding. So Carrie, take it away.
Oh, sorry. I don't know that we have too many questions just yet in the Q&A.
Okay.
You gave us a lot of good information. I think that we had gotten various inquiries from states, and I think that you've given, some good indications of where to begin. But do you have any other advice I know that our president, when she went on her state visits, most often heard about dual enrollment. There was interest in dual enrollment across all of the MEC states. And things that most people could agree with, right? They wanted dual enrollment. What they didn't know how to begin, or they weren't sure about agreeing to, was the funding. And so I'm curious if you have any other good resources, or of things that are forthcoming that might also add to this library of information for those who are interested in moving things forward in that direction.
Yeah, so and a similar question came up on a NASEC webinar on this topic last week, and I think some of the key takeaways from that discussion were one, build a coalition. So I was involved in changing dual enrollment legislation in one state when I was back at ECS, and the governor's office had really pushed for some improvements to their dual enrollment legislation, was hoping to maybe even include some funding in that. So they had folks from state agencies, from different higher education institutions, but for whatever reason, they didn't manage to get anybody from the school districts involved. And as the legislation was initially filed, it was going to have the school districts fully paying tuition for students, and you can imagine that did not fly very well with superintendents and others. And so it's really important not just to have a coalition of state and local, but make sure that all of the different stakeholders are represented. The legislation was eventually passed, and it's been very successful, but that was just one initial hiccup that happened. So coalition building is essential, and having the right folks in your coalition to lobby for enhancements. And then second of all, making sure that you have data to make the case for increasing funding or other aspects of dual enrollment policy that you think need to be changed. So do we know for a fact that students in low-income school districts or high schools are less likely to enroll in dual enrollment? Do we know that tuition can pose a barrier, or maybe it's things other than tuition? Maybe it's textbooks or CTE equipment, materials, other things. But having some data to back up the statement, and then also data either from your state or from another state that documents that students who dually enroll are more likely than their similar peers with similar socioeconomic backgrounds or academic backgrounds, otherwise more likely than their peers to not just finish high school, but matriculate, be less likely to require remediation, all of the other positive outcomes we see from dual enrollment participation in terms of post-secondary access and success.
Wonderful. Yeah, great insights. Thank you, Jennifer. We do have a question. How do you think the new education vouchers will affect the dual enrollment funding?
Is there a particular state that somebody's referring to, or?
It is anonymous, so I don't know unless somebody wants
Oh,
to add in
okay.
some. Could you give us some general impressions? And if I get some more specificity, I'll jump in on it.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the voucher program that this person is referring to. I do know that a number of states for a while have had ESA policies where there's or policy where they can set aside funds either for private school tuition or other expenses that are not necessarily covered by the school district. Maybe it's test prep or exam fees, what have you, and that dual enrollment tuition or other expenses was an allowable use of those funds that parents could draw down from. But I'm not familiar with the voucher legislation that someone's referring to. So if there's more information that someone could provide, I'd be interested and love to have a conversation about that.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, there's a various, opportunities. I think MEC has kind of gone through and talked about a few different kinds of things related to dual enrollment, funding models being one. Do you see the intersection of what you're talking about in terms of the funding models impacting some of the other lines of work that especially MEC, but other organizations have done research in and have kind of provided insight in as well, like teacher credentialing, for example, but then also I know OER is one. Just kind of interested in the connections you may be making, because I know you're researching in a few different areas in this big umbrella.
Yeah, dual enrollment funding definitely ties into other dual enrollment policy topics. So, for example, you mentioned OER, and we're closing out a project with MEC and SRAB, the Southern counterpart to MEC, right now on using OER in dual enrollment programs and what are some of the key levers that already exist for OER policy that dual enrollment might be plugged into, or dual enrollment levers that OER policy might be plugged into. Because even if a state covers student tuition or heavily discounts student tuition, in many instances, textbooks can pose a considerable barrier, either for students, if the students are responsible for paying for textbooks, or for school districts or institutions, if either the district or the institution is required to cover the textbook cost. Because if it's covered by the institution, they may limit the number of seats in the course or the number of sections of a course being offered, particularly for STEM courses where the textbooks tend to be significantly more expensive than for liberal arts courses. If the school district is paying for the books, they might try to use the same edition of a textbook over multiple semesters, and as such, they might tell students not to write in the textbook or not to take the textbook home, which, as you might imagine, could have negative implications for student outcomes in the course if they're not able to study or use the textbook outside of the regular school day. That said, we're not finding that many states have explicit policies that encourage the use of open educational resources in dual enrollment settings, even if they do have an OER initiative for post-secondary institutions writ large. There are a few exceptions. West Virginia policy that was passed, I think, last year strongly encourages state-funded dual enrollment programs, and that's one of the states where students do not pay tuition to use OER. And then in a couple of other state-funded models in college in Hawaii is what they call the early college model, but it's really concurrent enrollments where the course is offered at the high school, either by an approved high school teacher or a faculty member traveling to the college high school campus. Both that and Massachusetts model strongly encourage the use of OER, again, to maximize those state funds and minimize costs that may be passed along to school districts, institutions, or students. Another area that's where dual enrollment finance plays in is another project that I'm working on right now for College and High School Alliance on dual enrollment credit transfer. And again, with more and more states adopting a state pays funding model, we want to make sure that students are actually able to apply those credits towards a certificate or degree once they matriculate, but because of a lack of advising or a lack of awareness on transfer and applicability policies in the states, it seems from our survey data and from our focus groups and other data that's fairly common for students to earn a bunch of credits that they end up just applying as elective credits, or maybe they don't transfer at all because and then the state's investment in those courses is compromised, and when credits don't transfer because they're not applicable to a student's certificate or degree, then students and parents, schools sometimes feel that their perception that dual enrollment is less than is validated, or they perceive that they shouldn't take dual enrollment because they don't know how credits might transfer out of state. There's a pervasive myth that if you're going to enroll in a college out of state, you need to take AP because institutions will always award credit for those exam scores, when we know, in fact, that's not the case. And in fact, dual enrollment credits may transfer as well, if not better, than AP or IB exam scores.
No,
So
that's
just
that's very helpful. Yeah. I mean, I think anywhere, that we've been and we've talked about dual enrollment, it seems like someone has an anecdote about bad transfer, right? Like that somebody had all of these credits and only a portion were applied or only a portion were accepted. And so we look out for that. That research would be really interesting to a lot of people, I'm sure.
Yeah, and it's my understanding that even though the research is wrapping up now, the report is likely to be released either late summer or fall. But yeah, I wish I could share more sneak previews from that one. I can't, I think I can share that. So many of you may be aware that College and High School Alliance put out a survey a month or two ago inviting people to weigh in on their perceptions of their state's dual enrollment transfer policy or post-secondary transfer policy writ large. What are some of the challenges for students in terms of credit transfer? And then what do they perceive to be one of the strengths of their state or institution's approach to dual enrollment credit transfer? And we actually discovered that even among people who are working in this space, secondary and post-secondary stakeholders sometimes had misperceptions about their own state policy, which is very surprising because these aren't just a random, student or teacher or parent or someone. These are people who are doing this work day in and day out. And, I'm very well familiar with the policies in some of these states, and they would say things that contradicted what was actually in state policy. So clearly there's some professional learning opportunities out there for states and organizations like MEC to help on the ground program staff and possibly also institutional like registrars and other staff better understand their own state policies and how students can be better served when there's a better awareness of state policies on the local level.
Yeah, lots of myth busting to do. I appreciate that. There are some pending dual enrollment funding legislation, kind of opportunities out there. Those who are still, interested in putting some information about things that might be going on in your states that you'd like to discuss, we'd love to hear that. But is there anything in that landscape, Jennifer, that you're particularly keeping your eye on in terms of a big change, something innovative, something that may be useful to a variety of stakeholders, or even just surprising to you as someone so well read in the field?
Yeah, just because of the projects that I've been working on right now haven't really called on me to dive into 2025 legislative changes. I don't have a great perspective on things that are moving along that are either concerning or very exciting. I am aware of legislation that's sitting on the governor's desk in Colorado right now that would create a post-secondary credit transfer website. And so it would not just be for dual enrollment or traditional post-secondary credit transfer, but would also include information on transfer and applicability of AP, IB exams, some other exams, prior credit for prior learning. And so kind of putting everything in one place so that students aren't taking X, Y, and Z AP classes and taking those exams, and then also at the same time taking dual enrollment, not realizing that not all of that is going to apply towards gen ed or major requirements, that some credits may be duplicative.
Mhm.
So I'm hoping that the governor will sign that. Just happens to be also very topical on the project that I'm working on right now.
Yes,
So.
absolutely. Yeah, I know. It seems that there's a lot of different opportunities for greater transparency in terms of giving students and families better information. And sometimes, you hit on the advising piece a little bit, in terms of the value that brings to the dual enrollment experience, but really setting the student on a path that's meaningful ultimately. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that may be a shortfall in a lot of places and may have, direct impact on that transferability question, right? Is that just a little bit of better information upfront could have shifted the balance one way or the other? Are there any places that do particularly good advising from your perspective, or that you've seen models that really do maybe a little bit of a higher touch for students at that first touch point in order to set their course more intentionally?
Yeah, this project did not look so much at the quality of advising, but one of the questions for the dual enrollment transfer project was, does state policy require that students and parents receive information about whether and how credits will transfer and apply, especially prior to enrolling in a course?
Mhm.
Because it's not very helpful if you're halfway through the semester and then find out that, the credit you thought was going to apply to your gen eds doesn't actually apply. Um, but Colorado is there's a handful of states in the report. I just remember off the top of my head that Colorado is one, and they're very explicit in terms and policy in terms of the type of information that all students and parents must receive. And also, it's interesting in Colorado that programs are somewhat limited, but not in a bad way, in terms of the types of courses that may be offered to high school students through concurrent enrollment. So it either has to be um, a developmental course that might include like a co-requisite model, or it could be a prereq for a course that is the student wants to take for gen ed or a major requirement, or it's what's called GT transfer pathways. It's a set of courses that transfer across institutions, to public 2 and 4 institutions statewide, or it can be a CTE course, or it applies to the block transfer associate's degree. And so having those sort of guardrails around the types of courses that can be offered really clearly communicates to students and parents that the course should transfer. And I might add that Colorado has a policy that I'm not sure I've seen in any of the other states in my analysis that sets out that if a student believes that they should have received transfer credit for a course and the receiving institution is denying transfer credit, they may go through an appeals process through the Department of Higher Education.
Hmm.
So yeah, and the Department of Education is charged with, so overseeing that appeals process for institutions. And it's
Wonderful.
the Department of Education can find institutions in violation of state policies in terms of rejecting credit that they should have awarded transfer credit for.
Yeah, that's really interesting, right? Like uh, yeah, it impacts the student's experience, but it also, right, it's the responsible use of these funds, right? That transfer piece, I think, is really interesting, and I'm sure something that we'll continue to hear about in terms of your ongoing research. Yeah, this is the last call for questions. If anyone has any questions, I don't know if we didn't hit on anything. I even tried to get you to talk a little bit about some sneak peeks. So apologies for apologies for that. But is there anything else you wanted to add in terms of your upcoming work, or anything you wanted us to keep an eye on as the dual enrollment landscape continues to change and grow?
The only other thing I can think of in terms of pending projects is, and I think you mentioned this earlier, Carrie, the research that we've been doing on teacher credentialing policies for dual enrollment. And so I've looked at teacher credentialing policies across the 19 Higher Learning Commission states, and have done some interviews with folks in those at the state agency level in those states, and maybe some of the folks on this call were interviewed for that. But looking at post November 2023, when HLC revised its policy, we saw a major shift away from Masters plus 18 to local decision. And so the report that I hope will be coming out later this year will unpack some of the experiences of states in terms of what's happened as a result of states shifting to a local decision, and what does that actually look like at the local level in terms of the variation from one institution to the next, and the qualification or credentials that a high school teacher must possess to be approved to teach college coursework.
Yes, yep. This is interesting, and again, doing our advisory groups over the winter into the spring, the advisory groups themselves were dedicated to that one piece of the dual enrollment puzzle. And yet, as we started to talk to the states and through some of the difficulties they were having, it began to pull in a bunch of different kinds of things, including funding, especially in thinking about that rural, the breakdown of students and where they're located and what access they have to the kinds of courses that they ultimately want, or, that will set them on a good path. So yeah, wonderful. Well, I think that we're probably pretty close to the end here. So I thank you for joining us today. A huge thank you to Jennifer for sharing her findings in this updated report. I learn something from you every time I talk to you, and I talk to you a lot. So that's just a credit to the depth of your expertise.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks everyone. Thanks, MEC, for hosting me. And thank you all for participating in today's webinar. And feel free to reach out with any follow-up questions.
Yes, absolutely. And just as a reminder, please complete the survey that you'll get. The survey will be available when you exit the webinar, and the link will also be placed in the chat. We've already posted the presentation to our website, and so we'll post the recording of today's event soon, and it will be available on the MEC website as well. We hope that you'll keep informed with MEC by subscribing on our website. We do a quarterly dual enrollment update, which is just about ready to go out. So this is a great time to subscribe to that and get some updated information about what we have going into the summer, and then ultimately the fall as well. So thanks for joining us, everyone, and have a nice afternoon. Take care.